You've tried to change your life, haven't you? You've set big goals. You've made dramatic promises to yourself. You've declared that this time will be different, that you're finally going to become the person you know you could be. And you've started strong, with passion, with conviction, with that surge of determination that makes anything feel possible. But then slowly the energy faded. The big vision became overwhelming. The gap between where you are and where you want to be started to feel impossibly wide. And you found yourself back where you started, carrying the additional weight of one more failed attempt, one more piece of evidence that maybe you're just not capable of real change. And the cruel thing is, you know what needs to happen. You know the person you need to become. You can see it clearly, but the transformation feels so massive, so far away, that you don't even know where to begin. So you do what you've always done. You wait for the right moment. You wait for more. Willpower. You wait for circumstances to shift, and while you wait, nothing changes, and the quiet desperation grows. The sense that you're trapped in patterns you can't break, that you're watching your life pass while some essential transformation remains forever out of reach. But what if you've been looking at change completely backwards? What if the reason your big attempts at transformation keep failing isn't because you lack willpower or discipline or commitment? What if it's because you're trying to change too much, too fast, in ways that violate how change actually works? What if real transformation, the kind that lasts, the kind that actually rewrites who you are, doesn't come from dramatic overhauls, but from something much smaller? What if everything you want to become is hidden inside the tiniest actions? What if the secret to becoming a different person isn't in the grand gestures, but in the barely noticeable shifts that seem too small to matter? What if small habits, the kind you could almost laugh at for how insignificant they appear, what if those are the only things that actually change everything? Not someday, not eventually, but in ways that are already working even when you can't see them yet. What if you've been ignoring the very mechanism through which human transformation occurs, dismissing it as too small to count, while chasing changes that are too big to sustain? Let me unfold this slowly, because this isn't about tips or tricks or life hacks. This is about understanding something fundamental about how you actually change, about how any living system changes, about why the small is not just effective but essential, and why the big dramatic transformations you've been attempting are almost guaranteed to fail. We live in a culture obsessed with dramatic transformation, with before and after photos, with radical reinvention, with the story of someone who completely changed their life in 90 days. And these stories are seductive because they promise speed. They promise that you don't have to endure the slow, unglamorous work of actually changing. You can just decide, take massive action, and become someone new. But here's what those stories don't tell you. They don't tell you about the hundreds of failed attempts that came before the one that worked. They don't tell you that the transformation, even when it looks sudden from the outside, was built on years of smaller shifts that were happening underneath. They don't tell you that most people who attempt dramatic change fail catastrophically and end up worse off than when they started. Because dramatic change, the kind that tries to override your entire system in one massive push, it triggers resistance. Massive resistance. Your whole being fights back. Think about your body for a moment. Your body has a mechanism called homeostasis. It's the process by which your body maintains stability, keeps everything within acceptable ranges. Your temperature, your blood sugar, your heart rate, all regulated to stay within specific bounds. And when something tries to push those systems too far too fast, your body fights back. It resists, it activates defense mechanisms. Because from your body's perspective, sudden dramatic change isn't transformation. It's a threat. It's danger. Something is trying to destabilize the system. And the same thing happens with behavior, with identity, with the patterns that make up who you are. You have a psychological homeostasis, a comfort zone, a set point for who you've been. And when you try to change too much too fast, when you declare you're going to completely reinvent yourself starting Monday, your whole psychological system perceives that as threat, and it resists, it sabotages, it pulls you back to what's familiar, what's known, what feels safe even if it's not serving you. This is why your dramatic attempts at change keep failing. Not because you're weak, but because you're working against the very design of how change happens in living systems. But small changes, tiny shifts, adjustments so minor they barely register as changes at all, these slip under the radar of your homeostatic mechanisms. They don't trigger resistance because they're not threatening. They're so small that your system doesn't even notice them as departures from the norm. You're not trying to become someone completely different. You're just doing this one tiny thing slightly differently, and your system allows it because it doesn't seem dangerous. It doesn't seem like a threat to your identity or your established patterns. And that tiny change, that microscopic shift, it gets woven into your daily experience. It becomes part of the fabric of your life. And once it's there, once it's integrated, it creates a new baseline, a new normal. And from that new baseline, another small change becomes possible. And then another, and another. And over time, through the accumulation of these tiny, non-threatening adjustments, you become someone completely different. Not through force, but through patient, gentle, persistent redirection. Not by overpowering your resistance, but by moving so subtly that resistance never activates. This is how real change happens. Not dramatically, but incrementally. Not overnight, but through the compounding of small actions repeated over time. Let's talk about compounding for a moment, because this is the magic hidden inside small habits. Compounding is the process by which small amounts accumulate into massive totals through time and repetition. You see it most clearly in finance. If you invest a small amount regularly and let it compound, it grows exponentially. Not linearly, but exponentially. The early returns seem laughably small. You put in $100, it grows to $102. Big deal. But you keep doing it month after month, year after year. And after a decade, you don't have just a little more money. You have dramatically more, because the returns were generating their own returns. The growth was building on itself. And the same principle applies to behavior. A small habit, repeated consistently, compounds, not just in the sense that you've done it many times, but in the sense that it changes you. It changes your identity. It changes what feels normal. It changes what you're capable of. And those changes create the foundation for further changes. You start by drinking 1 glass of water when you wake up. That's the habit. Laughably small. But you do it every day. And after a few weeks, you're someone who hydrates in the morning. That's now part of your identity. And from that identity, from that new baseline of being someone who takes care of their body first thing, other health behaviors become easier because they're congruent with who you've become. You've created a tiny shift in your self-concept, and that shift makes the next shift easier. This is the power of small habits. They don't just change what you do, they change who you are. And who you are determines what you do. So by changing who you are, even in the tiniest way, you change the entire trajectory of what becomes possible. You create a new attractor in your system, a new center of gravity. And your behaviors start to organize around that new center, not through force, but naturally, organically, because they're now aligned with your identity. Think about someone who starts meditating for 2 minutes a day. Just 2 minutes, that's the habit. It seems almost insulting in its smallness. How could 2 minutes possibly matter? But they do it every day, and after a month, they're someone who meditates. That's part of their identity now. They're a meditator, and from that identity, from that new way of seeing themselves. They start to notice other shifts. They find themselves pausing before reacting, breathing before responding, creating little gaps of awareness throughout their day. Not because they're trying to, but because meditation, even 2 minutes of it, has started to rewire how they relate to their experience. The habit was small, but the ripple effects are profound, because it wasn't just about the 2 minutes, it was about becoming someone who prioritizes inner stillness. And that identity shift, that's what changes everything. Now let's explore why we resist small habits, why they feel insufficient, why we're drawn to the big dramatic changes even though they never work. It's because small habits don't satisfy the ego. The ego wants to be impressive. It wants to tell a good story. It wants transformation to look like transformation. I'm completely changing my life. I'm becoming a new person. I'm doing this extreme thing. That's a narrative the ego can get excited about. But I'm drinking a glass of water every morning? That's boring. That's not impressive. That's not a story worth telling. And so the ego rejects it, dismisses it as too small to matter. And we listen to the ego because we want to feel like we're doing something significant. We want the feeling of transformation, even if we're not getting the results. And big dramatic changes give us that feeling. They let us feel like we're really going for it, really committed, really changing, even though we're actually just setting ourselves up to fail. Because the feeling of transformation and actual transformation are not the same thing. Actual transformation is quiet, unglamorous, built from tiny, unsexy choices repeated over long periods of time. It doesn't give you the rush of declaring you're going to change everything starting now. But it gives you something better. It gives you actual change, real change, lasting change. There's a teaching worth exploring here about the relationship between effort and transformation. We believe that the amount of change we create is proportional to the amount of effort we exert. That if we want big changes, we need big effort. And there's truth to that in some domains. But in the domain of personal transformation, of changing who you are at the level of habit and identity, the relationship is different. More effort doesn't create more change. Often it creates less, because effort creates tension, and tension creates resistance, and resistance prevents integration. When you're forcing yourself to do something, when you're using massive willpower to override your natural inclinations, you're in a state of internal conflict. Part of you is trying to change, and part of you is fighting back. And that conflict is exhausting. It drains your resources, and eventually the part that's fighting back wins. Not because it's stronger, but because you run out of energy to keep fighting. But when you're doing something small, something easy, something that requires almost no willpower, there's no conflict, there's no battle, you're just doing this tiny thing. And because there's no conflict, there's no exhaustion. And because there's no exhaustion, you can sustain it indefinitely. And sustainability, that's the key. Because transformation doesn't come from intensity, it comes from consistency. And you can't be consistent with something that drains you, but you can be consistent with something that's easy, something that's small. Let me tell you what happens over time with small habits. At first, nothing seems to change. You're drinking your water, you're meditating your 2 minutes, you're doing whatever tiny habit you've chosen, and you look at your life and it looks exactly the same. And this is where most people quit, because they're looking for evidence, they're looking for results, and they're not seeing them. So they conclude the habit isn't working. But they're looking too soon. They're expecting linear progress. They're expecting that if they do the habit for a week, they should see a week's worth of change. But change doesn't work that way. Change is non-linear. It's invisible for a long time. You're doing the habit, and it's creating changes inside you that you can't see yet. It's rewiring your neural pathways. It's shifting your identity. It's building new patterns. But all of that is happening beneath the surface. beneath the threshold of what you can consciously observe. And if you quit during this phase, if you decide it's not working because you can't see results, you miss the breakthrough. Because there's always a lag, always a delay between when you start a new pattern and when you see the effects of that pattern. And that lag, that valley of invisibility, that's where faith is required. That's where you have to trust the process, even though you have no evidence yet that it's working. But if you stay with it, if you keep doing the small habit even when you can't see results, something shifts. Suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, you notice changes. Not small changes, significant changes. Changes that seem disproportionate to the tiny habit you've been doing. And you realize the habit was working all along. It was just working beneath your awareness. It was building pressure, building momentum, and now that pressure is releasing. Now that momentum is visible, and what looked like nothing for weeks or months suddenly looks like everything. This is the power of the small. It works invisibly until it works undeniably. But you have to stay with it through the invisible phase. You have to keep showing up to the habit even when it seems pointless, even when you can't see what it's doing, because it's always doing something, always building something, always creating the conditions for the breakthrough that's coming. Let's talk about the relationship between small habits and awareness, because small habits are not just about behavior change, they're about consciousness change. Every time you do a small habit, every time you choose to do this tiny thing that you said you'd do, you're practicing awareness. You're practicing the ability to notice your impulses and choose differently. You're practicing the gap between stimulus and response. You're practicing self-regulation at the micro level. And those micro-level practices, they train your attention. They strengthen your capacity to be present with your experience without being completely controlled by it. Think about the habit of pausing for 3 breaths before checking your phone. Tiny habit. But every time you do it, you're practicing noticing the urge to check your phone and not immediately acting on it. You're creating space. You're interrupting automaticity. And that interruption, that tiny moment of choice, it's training you to be less reactive, less impulsive, more aware. And that awareness, that capacity to notice and choose, that generalizes. It doesn't stay confined to just phone checking. It spreads into other areas of your life. You start noticing other urges, other automatic patterns, and you start having choice around them, not through force, but through the awareness you've been cultivating through your small habit. This is why small habits change everything. Because they're not just changing the specific behavior, they're changing your relationship with yourself. They're changing your capacity for self-awareness and self-regulation. They're changing who you are at the level of consciousness. And when your consciousness changes, everything changes. Because you're no longer being lived by your patterns. You're living through them. You're aware of them. And awareness is the beginning of freedom. Not freedom to never have patterns, but freedom to relate to patterns consciously instead of unconsciously. Freedom to choose which patterns to feed and which to let wither. And that freedom, that's what allows for genuine transformation. Not transformation imposed from outside through discipline and force, but transformation that emerges from within through awareness and choice. Now, I want to address something important. The voice that says small habits are not enough. That says you need to do more. Go. Bigger, push harder. That voice is real and it will show up. It will tell you that these tiny changes are laughable, that they're not proportional to the size of your goals, that you're kidding yourself if you think drinking water or meditating 2 minutes or whatever your small habit is, that's going to create real change. And that voice will try to get you to abandon the small in favor of the big. To go back to the dramatic overhauls that feel more significant. And you need to recognize that voice for what it is. It's not wisdom. It's not your deeper knowing. It's your ego's need to feel impressive. Your conditioning that bigger is better. Your impatience with the slow work of real transformation. And when that voice shows up, you don't fight it. You don't argue with it. You just acknowledge it and gently return to the small. Because the small is where your power is. The small is what you can actually sustain. The small is what actually compounds into the transformation you're seeking. There's a paradox here worth sitting with. The smaller the change, the bigger the transformation. The less you try to force, the more you actually change. The more you focus on the microscopic, the more the macroscopic takes care of itself. This seems backwards. It seems like it shouldn't work this way. But it does, because you're not changing through force. You're changing through accumulation, through the patient layering of tiny choices that eventually create a completely different foundation. You're not trying to become someone different overnight. You're just doing this one small thing consistently, and that one small thing makes the next small thing possible, and the next. And before you know it, you're living a completely different life. Not because you overhauled everything at once, but because you stayed with the small long enough for it to compound into the big. Let me tell you what this looks like in practice. You start with one small habit. Maybe it's making your bed every morning. That's it. That's the only thing you're changing. And you do it every day, and it becomes automatic. And once it's automatic, once it's just what you do, you add another small habit. Maybe it's putting your phone in another room when you sleep. Tiny change. And you layer that on top of the first habit, and you keep going. Each habit small enough that it doesn't trigger resistance. Each habit simple enough that you can sustain it indefinitely. And over months, over years, you've built an entire architecture of habits, an entire way of being that's completely different from where you started. Not through one big, dramatic change, but through the accumulation of dozens of tiny changes. And the person you've become through this process, they're not the same person who started. They're someone who's been reconstructed from the ground up through small, patient, persistent redirection of behavior and attention. This is how masters are built. Breakthroughs, though those happen sometimes. But through the daily practice of small habits. The writer who writes 200 words every morning. The musician who practices scales for 15 minutes. The athlete who does their mobility work without fail. These don't look impressive. They look almost trivial. But they're not. They're the foundation. They're the bedrock. They're the small habits that over time create the capacity for greatness. Not because the habits themselves are great, but because they create consistency. And consistency creates competence. And competence creates confidence. And confidence creates the willingness to attempt harder things. And the cycle continues, all starting from something small enough that you could barely call it a change. If you're hearing this, if something in these words is resonating with the part of you that's tired of failed transformations and ready for something that actually works, I want to invite you to make a small gesture, like this video. Subscribe to this channel, not because it matters to me, though I appreciate it, but because that small action, that tiny commitment, it's practice. It's you doing something small that aligns with who you want to become. Someone who values depth over drama. Someone who understands that real change is built from tiny choices. And if you can do it here, you can do it everywhere. You can start looking at your life through the lens of small habits. You can start asking not what massive overhaul you need to attempt, but what tiny adjustment you could make that would be sustainable. What microscopic shift would be so easy you couldn't fail at it. And then you can begin. Not with fanfare, not with dramatic declarations, but with quiet, patient, persistent action. With the understanding that small is not a compromise, small is the strategy, small is the way. As we close, I want to leave you with this. You don't need to change everything. You don't need to become a different person overnight. You don't need massive willpower or superhuman discipline. You just need to change one small thing, one tiny habit, something so small it almost embarrasses you to call it a goal, and you need to do that small thing consistently, every day, without drama, without expectation of immediate results, just showing up to this tiny commitment you've made to yourself. And if you do that, if you stay with the small, even when it feels insufficient, even when you can't see results, even when everything in you wants to go bigger, you will transform. Not because the small habit is magic, but because transformation is what happens when you change who you are at the level of daily practice. When you become someone who keeps commitments to themselves, someone who values consistency over intensity, someone who understands that the path to everything you want runs through the barely noticeable. And once you understand that, once you've experienced the power of small habits to reshape your entire existence, you won't need convincing anymore. You won't need motivation. You'll just do the small things. Because you'll know from direct experience that small habits change everything. Not someday, not theoretically, but actually, concretely, in ways you can feel and see and live. So start small. Smaller than feels reasonable. Smaller than feels significant. And stay with it. That's all you need to do. The transformation will take care of itself.